Hi, I'm Patrick Pusher, Principal Technical Evangelist at Orca Security, and today we're going to be taking a look at another comparison between Palo Alto Networks, Prisma Cloud, and Orca Security. We released the first round of the Prisma Cloud Punch-Out comparison about a year ago, and we'll link to that feature below in the description. Like round one, we are going to focus on the value and the fidelity of the alerts associated with each platform in terms of the real, meaningful intelligence focused on the risk to my security posture. This comparison was done against Prisma Cloud Enterprise Edition as of August 20th, 2021. Palo Alto Networks Prisma Cloud Enterprise Edition is comprised of both Prisma Cloud and Prisma Cloud Compute. Unlike our first round, we'll be focusing on both products together in this feature. So imagine for our sample scenario today then, that we are IT managers and we've acquired new cloud infrastructure by way of M&A. Imagine acquiring brand new infrastructure without the expertise and history to support it, without the people to explain exactly how everything works and is secured. So our real world goal would be to not only establish how this infrastructure functions, but from a security perspective, where we're covered, where we're not, and where the largest risks are. Okay, great. Let's dive in. The first thing we're going to consider is what's involved in deploying each of these solutions in our cloud environment to gain some actionable insight. Let's go ahead and onboard our new AWS account with Orca. I'm logged into AWS already, and back at Orca in a separate tab, we will leverage the CloudFormation stack to build the prerequisite cross-account role and attached policy. This policy will provide access to the services that Orca measures, as well as what is required for the side scanning process. More on that shortly. So while the stack executes, let's navigate to Outputs and go ahead and refresh. Now we have the Amazon resource name, or ARN, that was created once the stack was executed. So we'll copy this ARN for use back in Orca and paste it. Once we hit Connect Account, Orca will verify that the permissions are in fact correct, and then it will begin performing its initial scans. So let's move now to deployment of Prisma Cloud Suite. For Prisma Cloud, the Cloud Security Posture Management, or CSPM side of the suite, installation looks very similar to Orca. We've gone ahead and sped up the process and stripped some clips out. But basically, we choose our cloud type, we choose whether we want read-only or read-write for some enforcement, and then we launch our CloudFormation-based provisioning, much like we did with Orca. We grab the generated ARN from the output and bring that back to Prisma Cloud. Unlike Orca, however, we aren't finished with the Palo Alto Networks deployment. Prisma Cloud Compute, the other half of the Prisma Enterprise Edition, is the portion of the offering that considers workloads and containers and is deployed using workload agents. This means that we must reach each resource and install the correct type of Prisma Cloud Compute Defender, what they call security agents. Although sizable, the Defender install is straightforward. We've sped up much of this footage up for the sake of the video. As we begin to consider the rest of our environment, however, we quickly cross-reference the Prisma Cloud Compute online documentation, and it reveals that 2 of our 5 EC2 workloads will not be covered. XYZ internal account proc, as it is based on Debian 8.1, and XYZ internal HR benefits, as it is based on Ubuntu 14.04. Even more challenging in some scenarios is that Prisma Cloud agents or defenders must be able to communicate with the backend. And if we reference our lab diagram, once again, we have a private subnet where no communication in or out is possible. So by default, with no changes to our environment, we have only 2 hosts with 1 container that can participate in this exercise. Since we want a broader test than that, I went ahead and made the changes required to reach XYZ internal MGMT, which appears to be a Windows workload. These changes are not trivial and include IP address assignment, the creation of NAT gateway, and security group changes. These changes effectively turned a private workload public. So in the end, we bring XYZ internal MGMT on the private subnet back into scope, but at the cost of fundamental network changes that make our network quite a bit less private. Now that we have both products deployed, mostly, let's have a look at the alert findings. Let's first review the inventory within Prisma Cloud and Prisma Cloud Compute. Within the inventory main menu item, you will find a relatively comprehensive inventory of our AWS cloud resources, including almost all the resources associated with our cloud environment. I say almost because the interface is lacking the detail of our container. What you see in this interface is all of the resources that Prisma Cloud can understand by asking AWS questions via API, like most cloud security posture managers do. So while it's true that while we can even see down to our individual workloads, we can't see inside them, so to speak. For that level of detail, we must navigate away from this interface and into the Prisma Cloud Compute main menu item. There's history here regarding how these two technologies came to be through acquisition, but all that's important for our exercise today is that they still remain very loosely integrated. Before we get there, however, let's visit alerts. This section suffers the same fate as the main inventory in that all we see here are cloud-focused alerts and nothing to do with workloads. That's next, but first, we see what we tend to see with most tools that measure posture: good tests with poor risk assignment. My most severe alert is that the default security groups that come configured with every AWS account aren't restrictive enough. But sit yourself on a security operations team where high severity alerts originate from a variety of sources. Is this alert really high priority? I'm not arguing it shouldn't exist, but in the big picture with wider context, perhaps it shouldn't carry the same severity as malware or even public S3 buckets. Are these default security groups assigned to anything? Did Prisma even check? Prisma was able to tell me other important things, like CloudTrail not being enabled, some specific things about my IAM policy and the use of my cloud root account, and a lot about my public S3 bucket. In fact, more than when we first compared Prisma Cloud and Orca Security a year ago. Still, the risk assignment is hard to understand. Why is the lack of server-side S3 encryption risked as low, and my go nowhere default security group configuration risked as high? As promised, let's navigate to compute, and let's choose the host's radar. We see our three hosts all in a state of red alert from a vulnerability perspective. Even the way these hosts and containers are represented here in Prisma Cloud Compute is different from what we just saw in the Prisma Cloud inventory. Vulnerabilities look reasonable on our Windows host, but compliance looks very scarce. The risking of these vulnerabilities seems to be largely influenced by the CVSS score of each vulnerability, plus a few more criteria. Our other Linux-based hosts look reasonable from a vulnerability perspective, and much better from a compliance perspective too, with support for tests including CIS generic Linux, for Ubuntu 16.04, CIS Amazon Linux 2, and CIS Docker. Navigating to the containers radar, we see both the Prisma Cloud Compute Defender container and our XYZ Finance PayWeb container, which is red. Navigating inside, we see many vulnerabilities ranked in the same fashion as previously mentioned, and two compliance failures, one that detected a private SSH key in the container, and one belonging to the CIS Docker standard around root user permissions. There is also a large alert stating that we have an unprotected web application, which leads you to the Palo Alto Networks WAAS functionality. Lastly, to review cloud compliance, we must navigate back out to the main menu and choose compliance. We are squarely inside the Prisma Cloud side of the suite now, so don't expect any more insight into workloads. Our resource total here is different than in the inventory section, which is likely explained by the fact that not every type of resource is measured in the compliance standards supported by Prisma Cloud, but that isn't totally clear. Prisma Cloud has good support for a wide range of cloud compliance standards. Clicking into any given standard and adjusting the filters on the left will get you an overview of your compliance score, and subsequently clicking on either assets or alerts will take you to the more detailed practitioner-focused perspective. With all of that, let's take a look at our findings in Orca. As we did with Prisma Cloud and Prisma Cloud Compute, let's have a look at our inventory. Orca tells us the vast majority of our resources are safe, but 8 are at risk. The filters on the left tell me those resources include containers, storage, IAM, and VMs. Expanding a filter shows me all the more detailed filtering I can do to achieve my desired perspective. You'll also notice the inventory is unified and includes both cloud and workload types of resources. This is also the case for alerts, which we'll cover next. Although we see the top 5 risks in each category across the Orca dashboard, let's use the alerts interface to review. Orca is showing us a total of 32 alerts, 18 hazardous, 1 imminent compromise, and 13 compromised. Once again, this number represents risk identification across your whole cloud estate, including both cloud and workload resources. Cloud and workload risks are always unified within Orca. As we click each risk severity level, we further break down each alert category, what types of resources are affected, and then we get to the individual alerts. We have 9 cases of malware found on our Windows host and 4 in our Linux container XYZ Finance PayWeb. For imminent compromise, we have only 1 alert, and it is a roll-up of vulnerabilities that have to do with an old version of web server software, Apache. Let's drill deeper into this alert. This alert states that Apache needs an upgrade, and if we do, we'll take care of all the CVEs you see in the list to the left at the same time. The reason that this alert is risked as imminent compromise is that there are several contributing and serious risk reasons, and the service is directly exposed to the public internet, and we know malware exists in the same container. Our hazardous alerts are spread across 6 categories, but let's review them as a group in the interest of time. Orca found a password in shell history, PII in our storage bucket, another roll-up of vulnerabilities to do with the SSHD service, several unsupported host OS alerts for Ubuntu 14.04 and Debian 8.1, meaning that the vendor no longer supports this version of the operating system, and as such, it represents significant risk. A weak host password, which may be easy to guess or may be easy to brute force. A non-corporate authentication key, which is usually a sign of at least illegitimate use. And let's look at this insecure private key. This is a private key on one of the machines that we could not deploy Prisma Cloud Compute to due to the fact that the OS was not supported. Once we click into it, we'll also see what machines my key provides access to, and as what user. We see an alert for misplaced cloud credentials, in this case AWS keys. As promised, in the same place, we also have alerts that have to do with other types of cloud resources, like S3 buckets. If we click on the resource name, we can review all the alerts associated with that resource. Lastly, we have a couple of alerts to do with the misuse of our root account from a best practice perspective. Navigating over to compliance, we see the wide range of compliance standards at all levels: application, workload, and cloud. If we close the view selector, we can see that all the compatible compliance standards are automatically and continuously evaluated. I can export this information in a few different ways, but I can also schedule a regular reoccurring report to help me show progress over time. So we've compared inventory and alerts with a brief look at compliance, and 2 things really stand out for me. The first is just how much context is used to assign risk to alerts in Orca. Orca raised 32 alerts with a severity of high, medium, or low. Prisma Cloud Enterprise raised hundreds and hundreds of alerts, both across the cloud side and the compute or workload side. It's one thing if all of these alerts represented real imminent risk, but as we discussed earlier, the majority of them don't. Remember those high severity default security group alerts in Prisma Cloud? You'll find them in Orca as well, but they are deprioritized using intelligent context. The second thing that stands out to me is Orca's ability to scan hosts and containers without deploying any agents or any code at all. Deploying Prisma Cloud is straightforward, but deploying Prisma Cloud Compute defenders to each workload is challenging. It wasn't possible in our small sample lab. Imagine what an enterprise deployment would look like. So to sum up, let's again consider our lab diagram, but now let's layer on top all the things we planted in the environment. These are the same things that we would have no idea about if we had truly just inherited this environment and we are looking at it for the first time. And in fact, these are the things that we would really depend on these cloud security products to find in the end. So what did each find? For this cloud security punch-out round, we set out to test Palo Alto Networks' Prisma Cloud Enterprise agent-based runtime product claims. When the initial Punch-Out comparison feature that compared Orca Security and Prisma Cloud debuted last year, Palo Alto Networks replied with a cease and desist letter. Of note is that they didn't take exception to any of the claims in the feature, but rather focused on their contract terms that prohibit reviews and comparisons of Palo Alto Networks products entirely. Orca believes that the best way practitioners can choose the tools that work for them is a mix of factual evidence to demonstrate current capabilities and more traditional marketing materials to help underscore the values, design, and future of a product or platform. Palo Alto Networks responded to Orca's own very public response about the legal threat by espousing its real-time agent-based capabilities. Palo Alto Networks made several claims about the superiority of its agent-based approach that Orca took exception with. But in the continued spirit of letting each product speak for itself, Orca decided to test these claims in the lab. Like any responsible security company, we sent our very detailed findings to Palo Alto Networks months ago, with the goal of having ample time to address. But instead of doing so, they were simply denied as problems altogether. We are publishing them here for you to decide on your own. We first identified and disclosed these issues to Palo Alto Networks in June. When retesting as of August 20th, 2021, we noticed similar behavior. With that, let's dig in. Our tests focused around 4 main detection scenarios: malware detection, crypto miner and lateral movement detection, Tor node communication detection, and active exploit detection. Focusing first on malware detection, we obtained samples of both academic and real malware in the wild and planted it on hosts within Palo Alto Networks defenders installed and configured. It's communicating with the backend, and so we expect the detection of these malware payloads within Prisma Cloud. We loaded malware from 3 different families onto hosts to test: Windows-based Mimikatz, Turla-based Windows malware, and XBash-based Linux malware. Certainly, while the existence of such code should be enough for detection, we executed each as well. Prisma Cloud Compute did not detect on any of the malware in question. It's great that a command executed in the installation script was detected as suspicious, but the malware itself was not detected. Throughout all of our competitive testing, we have never seen a malware alert generated by Prisma Cloud Compute. Next, we focused on crypto miner detection. We decided to use the popular open source XMRig crypto miner that should be easily detected. Indeed, when we attempt to run XMRig on our host, Prisma Cloud detects it. However, all that's required to thwart that detection is a simple file rename. When we simply rename that crypto miner, a very trivial attempt to evade detection, Prisma Cloud no longer alerts us at all. This simple file rename strategy is very similar to how lateral movement detection can be evaded as well. Prisma Cloud Compute alerts on the use of the netcat binary when listening on a port. However, if you rename that binary and issue the very same command, Prisma Cloud Compute will not alert on it. Just like the last example, it seems that all that's required for evasion is the renaming of a simple executable binary. Next, let's communicate with some Tor exit nodes. Prisma Cloud Compute lists support for detection of such, so let's use HTTP and find 4 Tor destinations with web serving capabilities and reach out and communicate with them. We do so, and Prisma Cloud does not alert on such at all. If we look at outbound connections, we can see some of them, but it's clear that they are not being flagged as Tor nodes and therefore risky at all. Lastly, we focused on a popular exploit using open source software Drupal. This has to do with CVE 2018-7600, one that Palo Alto Networks has written about in the past. This is a vulnerability that supports remote code execution. We have Drupal version 8.5.0 installed on a host, and we'll be using our local workstation to interrogate and exploit it. On that same host, of course, we have a Palo Alto Networks Defender installed and configured. Back on our host, let's launch our Ruby-based exploit and point it at our web server serving the old, susceptible version of Drupal. The exploit is quite verbose, and near the end we can see that we are successful in our attempt by writing to the web root, but also in opening up a remote shell to the web host. Prisma Cloud Compute did not alert on this active exploitation scenario at all, despite having the feature set enabled to do so. In summary, we found several simple scenarios whereby Palo Alto Networks' Prisma Cloud Enterprise runtime detection of malware, crypto miners, lateral movement, Tor node communication, and active exploitation was thwarted with minimal effort. We retested our findings on the current software as a service release of Prisma Cloud Enterprise Edition as of August 20th, 2021. Out of the box, so to speak, Orca and Prisma Cloud Enterprise were both able to find the public S3 bucket and some IAM observations around the cloud root account, configuration, and usage. Prisma Cloud Enterprise was able to find one of the private keys in a container, but not the other one on a host. Only Orca was able to tell us about more than one family of malware on two separate hosts, poorly aging unsupported host operating systems, service vulnerabilities with CVE rollups, misplaced sensitive AWS keys, weak host passwords, and passwords in shell history, all of which can be used to move laterally in your network, or even worse, to gain access to your cloud configuration. Orca was also able to tell us that we had personally identifiable information in our S3 bucket. From a bigger picture perspective, only Orca is deployed effortlessly and exactly one time with no agents versus Prisma Cloud Enterprise being deployed both at the cloud level, but also on each host you wish to protect. Both Orca and Prisma Cloud Enterprise did a good job of detecting host, container, and cloud vulnerabilities and misconfigurations, as they did with Linux, container, and cloud compliance. Windows compliance didn't work well for us. Orca detected multiple occurrences of malware on multiple hosts, where Prisma Cloud Enterprise found none. Orca required no changes, where Prisma Cloud Enterprise required tangible network modifications, such that traffic from workload agents could reach the service backend. These changes left my network more public than I wanted. Orca prioritizes alerts using both external and environmental context, including how easily a resource is accessed from the internet. Only Orca supports scanning a wide range of both old and new operating systems without the use of agents or any code at all with no impact to your workloads. It even supports resources that are powered off. Orca is able to determine this information really in two ways. The first, the process of side scanning, where Orca analyzes the storage that powers your workloads, and the second, a healthy dose of context, a mixture of that data-driven intelligence with cloud control plane measurements, including security groups, route tables, IAM permissions, and much, much more. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you join us for another Punch-Out match.